There are hundreds and thousands of criminal cases where the killers were never caught due to insufficient evidence. But with advancements in technology and the use of genetic genealogy, many cases are being reopened and solved every year. In this video, we'll be looking at decades-old cold case files that were solved using the wonders of genetic genealogy. Stay tuned, because in one case, even a victim was identified using the technique. Eve Wilkowitz. On the evening of March 21, 1980, 20-year-old Eve Wilkowitz went out to dinner and saw a movie in Manhattan with her boyfriend Jack Dempsey. They returned to Dempsey's home so Eve could take a quick nap and asked her boyfriend to wake her up in time to catch the 12:35 train back to Bayshore, Long Island. Eve worked in Manhattan for Macmillan Publishing House as a secretary. Prior to her disappearance, Eve had expressed concern to her roommate, Robert Grogan, that she was being followed on her walks back home from the train station. As a result, Eve would take a taxi. During the early morning hours of March 23, 1980, Grogan noticed that Eve had not returned home. A few hours later, he would report her missing. On March 25, 1980, Eve's body was discovered after a woman noticed a barefoot figure on her neighbor's lawn. She was wearing blue jeans and a blouse, and her wrists had rope marks on them, suggesting she had been held captive for 3 days. Eve's socks and shoes were never found. Evidence would later show that she was sexually assaulted, and the cause of death was strangulation. A few months later, 2 other women would be killed near Long Island train stations. Paula Morris was a 17-year-old high school honor student who was found shot to death approximately 2 blocks from the Copiague train station. At the same time, 22-year-old Deborah Betts would be found stabbed to death also near the Copiague train station. The bodies of Paula Morris and Deborah Betts were found not far from where Eve's body was discovered. In 1981, the FBI was able to establish an abstract profile for Eve's killer, but no one was captured and the case went cold for decades. Eve Wilkowitz also had a sister. The last time police had arrived at her door, she was 17, and they told her they'd found her sister's body. That was 42 years ago. Irene has since gone to college, worked, married, raised 2 children, divorced, and moved away from Long Island, always in fear that the killer would one day come for her, wondering if they'd ever catch him. When detectives came to her doorstep once again in March this year, she tried not to expect too much. She couldn't bear more disappointment. She took a deep breath. Suffolk County Police Detective Jeffrey Botteri said, "We identified the person responsible for the death of your sister Eve. His name was Herbert Rice. He died of cancer in 1991 with 2 sons who had no idea what he'd done. Rice had never attracted suspicion. He had a short record of arrests for non-violent offenses, which did not require him to provide a DNA sample that would have been put in criminal databases. A query for relatives in the criminal database known as the familial DNA search failed as well. It was genetic genealogy that finally gave the police the answer. Irene Wilkowitz was living in fear for 42 years that she would be next. While it won't repair decades of terror, anxiety, and loss, she was able to get some much-needed closure." Lou Pacheco. In 1994, an anonymous letter writer began sending confessions to the Oregonian claiming to have committed nearly 5 murders along the West Coast. The author signed each letter with a happy face, hence he was given the nickname the Happy Face Killer. 1 year later, Keith Hunter Jesperson turned himself into authorities for murdering his girlfriend, Julie Winningham. He would later confess to other Happy Face murders, more than 100, but only 8 confirmed in California, Washington, Oregon, Florida, Nebraska, and Wyoming. He also submitted a letter to the Santa Clara County District Attorney in 2006, admitting to sexually assaulting and killing someone who was known to detectives as Blue Pacheco, because of what she was wearing at the time of her death. The killer did not know her identity either. Jesperson pled guilty to Jane Doe's murder in 2007. Her body was found on California State Route 152 in unincorporated Gilroy. The killer is currently serving several life sentences in Oregon for multiple homicides, but the victim was never identified. In 2019, cold case detectives at the sheriff's office partnered with the DNA Doe Project to see if DNA and genealogy could be used to uncover a name. The project used GED Match, a free genetic ancestry tool that allows users to upload their DNA profile and assist law enforcement to track down a relative of Blue Pacheco. The relative was not a close match to the victim, but they gave the project a start to find other ancestors. While the project filled out a family tree, the detectives at the sheriff's office contacted and asked family members to submit DNA samples to help the investigation. This year, on April 13th, the department finally matched the name with a DNA sample. It was Patricia Patsy Skipley of Colton, Oregon. She was finally identified 29 years after her death and 15 years after her killer pled guilty to the murder. It was the first time the office had used forensic genealogy to identify a Jane Doe, though they had successfully used it to find killers in the past. Skiple was a mother and longtime resident of Colton. She was around 45 when Jesperson took her life. While her family now knows where she has been all these years, sadly, Skiple's niece has also been missing for quite some time now. Diane Lynn Dahn. When Dawn missed her shift at the San Diego Transit Corporation on May 2, 1988, a coworker went to her apartment complex to check up on her. Her coworker discovered her lifeless body in her bedroom. Dawn had been strangled, bludgeoned, and stabbed, according to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. Her cause of death was stab wounds to the chest, and her death was ruled a homicide, investigators said. At the time, the San Diego County Sheriff's Homicide Unit conducted an extensive investigation, but the department came up short on identifying a suspect. Well, until now. Thanks to investigative genetic genealogy, investigators were able to track down the suspect, Warren Robertson, a man who also lived in the same apartment complex as Dawn in 1988. In 1988, Robertson worked as a local tow truck driver in San Diego, according to investigators. But after Dawn's murder, he left his family and moved about 20 miles away to Lakeside, California. A year later, Robertson moved to Indiana and lived there until he died at age 39 in a house fire on November 25, 1999. Cold case detectives couldn't figure out the connection between Robertson and Dawn. They did, however, find that both were racing enthusiasts and attended stock car races at the L.K. John Speedway around the time of Dawn's murder. In October 2000, a sample of DNA was taken from underneath Dawn's fingernails. Further testing was done in 2001, but according to the police, the profile was insufficient to place into a federal database of DNA from unsolved crimes, or CODIS. 10 years later, investigators opened Dawn's case again, looking for new leads and the use of new technology. A strand of hair that was found in Dawn's hand was processed and a profile was created, but it didn't produce any leads, even though it was consistent with the sample found underneath her fingernails. In May 2020, investigators started using investigative genetic genealogy, which combines DNA evidence and traditional genealogy to find a biological connection between people. After what investigators called an exhaustive process, 9 family trees were created with nearly 1,300 people connected to Robertson either through blood or marriage. Eventually, direct relatives of Robertson gave their DNA samples and confirmed his identification and matched the hair strand that was found in Dawn's hand. Dawn also had a son, Mark Byer, who was 2 years old at the time of his mother's murder. He was later adopted by a family and had no recollection of the incident. He spent 34 years wondering who murdered her and why. Byer said he was blown away when he heard how his mother's case had finally been solved. Family members who knew Dawn described her as a goofy, funny person who loved to draw, qualities Byer says he too has within him. Victoria Dawn Minter, Dawn's sister, said not knowing what happened almost consumed her all these years, but they finally got the closure they deserved. Have you ever witnessed a real-life cold case being solved? Did you take any part in it? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel for your regular dose of whodunits. See you in the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay warm, and don't get any crazy ideas.